All right, excellent. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Maddie, and it's great to have the opportunity to present to you today a little bit about what I'm studying and a very important topic. So I'll get right into it. So just to present a brief agenda of what I'll be going through today, I'll be presenting for around 40 minutes or so, and I'll start off by just giving an overview of the cannabis field in general, and then I'll get into some of the short and long-term effects of cannabis, including one of those long-term effects of cannabis use disorder. I'll talk about what that is and potential treatment options for it. And then in the last half of my presentation, I'll be discussing sex and gender and the influence that they have on cannabis use patterns and the effects of cannabis. And then I'll finish off by just briefly talking about some future directions, a cannabis study that you can get involved in, and then leaving you off with some cannabis resources. So first off, I'll just give a brief overview of what cannabis is, some trends that are going on, prevalence, and what the plant actually does and how it works in our body. So cannabis continues to be one of the most commonly used psychoactive substances worldwide, with an estimate of 188 million global users in 2017. And this number is continuing to increase over the past few years. And as you probably know, Canada legalized cannabis for non-medical purposes in October of 2018. And legalization has led to a number of dramatic changes, including an increase in people who use cannabis, changes in patterns of use and attitudes towards cannabis use. And it's also really led to an increase in the access, availability, and diversity of cannabis products. So in terms of prevalence rates, approximately a quarter of Canadians aged 16 years and older used cannabis in 2021. And as you can see here from the map, the percentages are quite similar across all of the provinces, with a higher prevalence in the territories and a little bit lower in Quebec. And of these people who use cannabis, approximately one quarter reported using cannabis daily. So approximately 6% of Canadians use cannabis on a daily basis. And then the average age of individuals start using cannabis around 18 years old. And lastly, the average Canadians tend to spend on cannabis per month is about $85. So now I'll just talk about what cannabis actually is. So it's called cannabis sativa, and it's a hemp plant that grows throughout warm temperature and tropical climates. And cannabis is a very complex plant, so it contains over 500 distinct compounds. And this plant contains chemical compounds called terpenes and flavonoids. And these are responsible for aromas, flavors, and the colors associated with cannabis. So that's why some different strains of cannabis may smell or taste slightly differently due to altering levels of these chemicals in cannabis. And then cannabis also contains cannabinoids, and these are chemical compounds that actually make up the plant and give rise to different effects. So the main cannabinoid is called delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, which is a mouthful, so I'll be referring to it as THC. So THC is psychoactive, and so that means it has an effect on our brain and how we think. So it's responsible for producing the high associated with feelings of cannabis, as well as the euphoric and mind-altering effects of cannabis. And then the second most common cannabinoid is cannabidiol, also known as CBD. And CBD has recently drawn an increased attention for its potential therapeutic properties. And CBD is thought to have very minimal psychoactive effects, so it doesn't really produce a high like THC does. It does have some other properties though. So when I discuss cannabis throughout my presentation today, I'll mainly be referring to THC and using THC and cannabis interchangeably. If I'm talking about CBD or something else, I will specify that. So now to discuss how cannabis actually works in our brain and in our body. So we all have something called an endocannabinoid system in our body, and this is a communication system with various important regulatory and regulatory functions throughout the human body and brain. And it's involved in various processes like energy and metabolism, reproduction, pain, appetite, learning and memory. So it's involved in a lot of different processes throughout our body. And the endocannabinoid system contains cannabinoid receptors that cannabis binds to in order to produce its effects. And so receptors are something in our brain. This is, you can kind of think of it as like a lock and key model. So if you think of a receptor like a lock, they're in our brain, and then cannabis would come in and it's like a key and it would bind into that lock. And when it turns, it activates an effect. And so that's how cannabis produces effects in our brain binding to these receptors. So these cannabinoid receptors are predominantly found in areas of the brain that are associated with reward and pleasure, concentrating, thinking, memory, coordination. And many of these receptors are also located in the brain's reward pathway. And this reward pathway interacts with other substances and enjoyable behaviors as well. But when cannabis binds to these receptors located in these brain regions located in the reward pathway, dopamine is released. And dopamine is a neurotransmitter that makes us feel pleasure and reward and reinforcement. And so this is also long-term how someone could become addicted to cannabis. And then lastly, our brains are still developing until around age 25. So during adolescence, the brain is particularly sensitive to drug exposure, and cannabis can actually impact how connections are formed within the brain when the brain is still developing. So cannabis can have a number of long-term effects, particularly thought to mostly impact cognitive development, but it can also play a role in the development of different mental health disorders like psychosis, which I'll get into a little bit later on. So now I'm going to discuss a little bit about cannabis potency and the different ways that you can actually consume cannabis. And so both the potency and diversity of cannabis products are really increasing and diversifying. So firstly, potency means the strength of cannabis. So the higher the potency would be, the stronger the effects of cannabis. And the average potency of cannabis has dramatically increased over the past couple of decades. So the average cannabis potency was around 4% THC in 1995, around 8% THC in 2008, and then one of the more recent available studies was done in 2017, and they found that the average potency was around 17% THC. So now, 5 years later, the average potency is really continuing to increase. So it's probably more around the low to mid 20s now. And this is really important because the stronger the cannabis, the greater the risks associated with use. And then secondly, there are also many different ways to consume cannabis, and this route of administration will alter the onset and the length of cannabis effects. And many of these products contain very high THC percentages. So I'll just go through some different ways that you can actually consume cannabis. So firstly, the most common way of consuming cannabis is smoking. So you would smoke the dried cannabis flower, and you can do this in different ways, like using a joint, a pipe, a bong. And I think probably the highest THC potency I've seen for dried flower is around 27% THC. Secondly is edible cannabis, and that's definitely becoming more popular. And this includes things like baked goods, chocolates, candies, gummies, and many different forms of edibles. And then there's also new cannabis beverages that have recently come onto the market. There's also THC vaporizers and pens, and they can also reach up to extremely high potencies. This one I think is 88% THC, and they also come in a variety of flavors like the strawberry one. There's also high potency THC concentrates like shatter and resin, and they can reach up to around 80% THC. And concentrates are vaporized in a specialized type of water bong, and this is something called dabbing. And then lastly, there's countless other cannabis products that I don't even have time to get into all of them, like sprays and drops and capsules, lotions, creams. And as I was looking for these photos on the Ontario Cannabis website, I saw there's products ranging from THC toothpaste to face masks. So THC is in a wide variety of products now, and we don't really know a lot about how these different products work. So it's really important for research going forward to understand how these work and what the health effects are of them. And then I wanted to discuss briefly the impact of non-medical cannabis legalization in Canada. So the Canadian Cannabis Survey was designed to help evaluate the impact of cannabis legalization and to better understand how Canadians view and use cannabis. So this survey collects information on kind of a number of different themes, and I just wanted to present some of the main findings from the 2021 survey. So, an increase in cannabis use since 2018. This is the year that cannabis was legalized. So, we have seen an increase in use. Cannabis smoking remains the most preferred method of consumption. So, even though there's all these new products coming to market, smoking is definitely still the most common. And then there's been a shift in individuals accessing cannabis from the illegal to now the legal market, which is great. And then fewer people have reported operating a vehicle after cannabis use. And then lastly, I just wanted to narrow down on some trends of who's actually using cannabis following legalization. So like I said, overall, there's been an increase since 2018, and you can see this across the years here. And then the highest use is among males and young adults. And so here, males, you can see that males use cannabis almost twice as much as females across all the years. And then young people as well. So in the 16 to 19 age group, as well as the 20 to 24-year age group, those are the age groups who are using cannabis the most frequently. And then it really drops off after 25. So now I'll switch gears a little bit and get into the short and long-term effects of cannabis. So cannabis use, like alcohol or any other substance, can exist on a spectrum. So this means that cannabis use is different for everyone at a given time, and the spectrum is dynamic, so individuals can move back and forth along this spectrum. So the first would be abstinence, so choosing to abstain from cannabis to avoid all of the health risks or other personal reasons. You can also use cannabis for therapeutic or beneficial reasons. So this would be cannabis use that has a positive impact, which could be psychological, physical, social, or spiritual reasons. There's also non-problematic or recreational use. So this is using cannabis with negligible health and social impacts. And this is someone who uses cannabis occasionally following low-risk guidelines, which I'll also to get into later. And then there's problematic use. So that's cannabis use that begins to interfere with a person's responsibilities and health. And then lastly, cannabis use disorder, which is cannabis use that has led to the addiction of cannabis use. So I just wanted to touch on the spectrum before I go into the long and short-term effects, because particularly the long-term effects can really differ depending on where someone is using cannabis along this spectrum. So in terms of the short-term effects, cannabis acts on kind of numerous areas of the body and brain, and this is because of those cannabinoid receptors that are located in many different areas of the brain. So cannabis produces good effects in some people, so that would be feelings of euphoria, relaxation, laughter. It can increase sociability in some people. There's also the alternative experience of bad effects, so people feeling dysphoria, anxiety, depression, fear, panic, and sometimes it can cause acute psychotic symptoms. And then there's also what we call neutral effects, so they're not really good or bad, and this would be things like causing drowsiness or an increase in appetite. Cannabis also can result in cognitive impairment, so such as difficulties with attention. It can impair ability to form new memories and shift focus. There's also physiological effects, so these are the effects that cannabis has on our body. So cannabis causes an increase in heart rate, also vasodilation. So this means that it decreases your blood pressure. And then it can also cause other effects like dry mouth or red eyes. And then lastly, there's also psychomotor effects. So this includes physical symptoms such as coordination impairment. It can disrupt your balance and cause delayed reaction time. So as you can see, cannabis really acts on numerous parts of your body and many different areas of functioning. And then I briefly wanted to talk about some of the beneficial or therapeutic aspects of cannabis. So there are many kind of anecdotal reports indicating the therapeutic uses of cannabis, but clinical studies supporting the safety and the efficacy of cannabis for therapeutic purposes in a variety of different disorders is limited, but the evidence is definitely slowly beginning to increase. So there are a couple of cannabis pharmaceutical products, with three of them approved for marketing in Canada. So the first one is called Nabalone, and it's an orally administered synthetic THC, and it's used to help cancer patients with severe chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting. The second one is called nabiximols, and it's an oral mucosal spray containing equivalent amounts of THC as well as CBD, that other cannabinoid that I discussed earlier that doesn't really have as many psychoactive effects. And nabiximols has been approved as an adjunctive therapy for spasticity and neuropathic pain in patients with multiple sclerosis, as well as persistent pain in adults with advanced cancer. And then lastly, Epidiolex is an oral oil-based product, and it contains almost pure CBD, so that kind of non-psychoactive cannabinoid. And it's used in a couple different forms of childhood epilepsy. And then on top of these different indications, there are also multiple positive studies published looking at cannabis and its potential therapeutic benefits. And these include conditions like using cannabis as an appetite stimulant for HIV and associated weight loss, different types of chronic neuropathic pain, as well as insomnia. And then there's also a lot of research being done in countless other areas, therapeutic areas of physical and mental health conditions, including things like various psychiatric disorders, inflammatory disease, obesity, glaucoma, and neurodegenerative disorders. So evidence is beginning to accumulate, but there's not really a lot of strong evidence besides for a couple of indications right now. So in terms of the short term and safety risks of cannabis, these really differ very depending on the type of product and method of use. So for example, smoking THC has much more severe health and safety risks than, say, using a CBD lotion. And risks also seem to be proportional to the amount of THC in the cannabis product. So with the higher THC content, having greater health and safety concerns. And then edibles also pose their own unique risk for a number of reasons. So firstly, the onset of high of edibles is quite delayed. So you can start to feel the effects from edibles up to 1 to 2 hours after consuming them, where smoking cannabis produces an immediate high. And then secondly, edibles are often kind of unclear in the dose that you should be taking. So usually if it's, say, a chocolate bar, you should really only be consuming about 1 square of chocolate, where sometimes people may think you're supposed to eat the whole thing. So for these reasons, people often take too much, so an overconsumption, and then they're overly intoxicated and can have an adverse reaction, having things like anxiety, paranoia. Sometimes it can produce hallucinations, vomiting, or panic. And then there's also great concern of children eating edibles. So these cookies and gummies don't really look any different than normal cookies and gummies. So there's a concern of children consuming edibles. And studies have actually found that since the introduction of commercial edible products, there's been a dramatic increase in monthly emergency department visits due to cannabis exposure in children. And then another safety concern is drug interactions. So cannabis can interact with other drugs, including things like sleeping pills, pain medication, heart medication, blood thinners, antidepressants, anti-anxiety medication, and then anything as common as like cold and flu medication. And so these interactions can cause adverse reactions and slightly change what your medication should be doing. So that's why it's important to talk to your doctor if you're on different medications and also using cannabis. And then lastly, driving under the influence of cannabis is a large safety concern. So despite some common myths that cannabis doesn't affect driving or you drive better on cannabis, that's not true. And cannabis definitely does affect your driving. And there's been a lot of continuous research demonstrating that it does cause collisions, and you should not drive under the influence. And then cannabis use also poses a risk not only for driving, but other activities like sports or biking, occupational hazards, and many other areas. And then the long-term effects of cannabis on physical health kind of remain poorly understood. In general, cannabis is not associated with mortality from overdose, but there are respiratory and cardiovascular health concerns, and some of these would be that cannabis smoke does contain carcinogens, and it does share some of the same toxic chemicals and particles as tobacco smoke. So there is a link between smoking and stroke, heart attack, and lung conditions. But this evidence is a little bit unclear at the moment in some areas, and this is just because it's difficult to do research in this area due to confounding factors like concurrent use of alcohol and tobacco. And then vaping illegal cannabis extract has also been associated more recently as well with some severe lung illness, in some cases resulting in death. And then cannabis hyperemesis syndrome is a relatively new diagnosis in patients with very chronic and heavy cannabis use. And the symptoms include recurrent vomiting, and people seem to have to take up to about like 30 hot showers or baths a day in order to alleviate these symptoms of recurrent vomiting. And it seems to be the only way to alleviate these symptoms. And the only long-term therapy for this syndrome is cannabis cessation, so stopping cannabis use. And then in terms of reproductive health, cannabis also has an effect on reproductive health, and there's evidence from both animal and human studies that suggest certain cannabinoids can have negative health effects on a variety of reproductive health measures in both men and women. And then in terms of cannabis use in pregnancy, so this is also difficult due to, this research is difficult due to confounding factors as well. But research has shown that heavy cannabis use during pregnancy is associated with a number of adverse birth outcomes. And early cannabis exposure while in the womb can cause or alter neurodevelopment, leading to adverse effects later in life. And then lastly, constituents of cannabis can pass through the breast milk during lactation, and those compounds can be absorbed and metabolized by the infant. So for these reasons, cannabis use during pregnancy and breastfeeding is definitely not recommended. And then there's also an association between cannabis use and various mental health conditions, and this is on the rise. So the rate of hospitalization for psychiatric disorders related to cannabis use actually doubled from 2006 to 2015. And we may continue to see this increase following an increase in use after legalization. So like I mentioned earlier, cannabis use during adolescence can affect how the brain develops, which in turn can kind of worsen or sort of trigger certain mental illnesses. So firstly, heavy and regular cannabis use has been shown to cause cognitive impairment, including having a long-term effect on concentration, memory, attention, and decision making. And then secondly, cannabis use can actually worsen symptoms of anxiety and depression. So if you're trying to use cannabis therapeutically for anxiety or depression, it could actually be making the symptoms worse. So it's really important you're always talking to your doctor to make sure that is the best option. And then lastly, perhaps one of the more studied or talked about connections is the link between psychosis and cannabis use. So a recent study found that cannabis was implicated in more substance-related youth admissions than any other drug, and a significant proportion of these admissions were due to psychotic symptoms either induced or exacerbated by cannabis intake. And so cannabis use during adolescence can cause these long-term changes to the brain, and these changes can kind of almost like trigger the development of psychosis in certain individuals. And this risk is particularly highest for individuals with a family history of psychosis, as well as young men and boys tend to be at a higher risk. And then to switch gears into cannabis use disorder. And so this is one of the long-term effects of chronic and heavy cannabis use as well. So I'll just talk about what it is, some risk factors, and potential treatment options. So despite some common myths, cannabis is an addictive substance. And so when someone becomes addicted to cannabis, this is what we call cannabis use disorder. So on average, I've seen some numbers as high as 1 in 4 people who use cannabis reporting cannabis use disorder. And some recent national surveys have found that cannabis use disorder among people who use cannabis has ranged from 12 to 31% in adults and 20 to 25% in youth. So these rates are quite high and seem to definitely be increasing. And then cannabis use disorder is similar to other substance use disorders and shares common signs and symptomology. And these include things like using more than you are planning on using, unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control your use, continued use despite negative consequences, and these consequences could be psychological, physical, or interpersonal consequences. Cannabis use where you're having to start reduce or give up your time spent at occupational, social, or recreational activities. The continued use of cannabis in dangerous situations like while driving. And then kind of more physical symptoms like a strong craving or a strong desire or urge to use cannabis when you're not using it. Tolerance. So this would be having to use more and more cannabis in order to kind of get that feeling that you got when you first started using it. And then withdrawal symptoms when you cut down and stop using cannabis. And some withdrawal symptoms would be things like irritability, a decrease in appetite, weight loss, restlessness, insomnia, dysphoria, anxiety, depression, as well as some gastrointestinal symptoms. And so depending on the number of signs and symptoms you meet criteria for, the severity of cannabis use disorder can range from mild, moderate to severe. And so there are some current treatment options for cannabis use disorder. So there's a number of current psychotherapeutic treatments, and these have been tested, and research has shown that the combination of these 3 treatments here, motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, and contingency management, the combination of these 3 kind of produces the best treatment outcomes. There's also a multi-dimensional family therapy, which is a family-based therapy and is showing some promise in adolescent patients. And then there's also some pharmacological treatments that are being studied or are currently being researched for cannabis use disorder. So these include things like cannabis agonists. So this would be substituting one of those pharmaceutical products, using one of those because they have kind of less side effects and they're less addictive than cannabis. Antidepressants, mood stabilizers, anticonvulsants, but unfortunately not a lot of these pharmacological treatments have shown much promise so far. And then lastly, there's also technology-based interventions for cannabis use disorder that have been developed in recent years. And these are internet-based treatments that seek to improve access, costs, and delivery of treatment. So in light of the changing landscape of cannabis and the increase in use and increase in cannabis use disorder that we're seeing, it's really crucial that research continues in this area to develop more and better treatment options. And then lastly, I just wanted to talk about some ways that someone could lower their risk of these long-term consequences like cannabis use disorder or physical and mental health conditions. So a group of researchers in Canada has put together a list of 10 recommendations to suggest ways to use non-medical cannabis more safely, and these are all based on scientific evidence. So the first is abstinence. So the only way to completely avoid risk associated with cannabis use is choosing not to use it. Secondly, the earlier in life you begin using cannabis, the higher your risk of serious health problems. So adolescents should delay using cannabis as long as possible. Three, there are many cannabis products, like I discussed, and many of these products are very high potency THC. And so these are worse for your health. So choosing to use low strength products or CBD products is better for your health. And then on top of all the cannabis products that I've already mentioned, there's also illegal synthetic cannabis products called K2 or Spice, and these can lead to severe health problems like seizures, hallucinations, irregular heartbeat. So these synthetic products should not be used. Fifthly, so individuals should reduce smoking cannabis and avoid smoking because smoking cannabis is the most harmful way of using cannabis and it can directly affect your lungs, so it should be avoided. But if you do continue to choose to smoke cannabis, then you should avoid inhaling deeply or hold your breath in order to avoid increasing the amount of toxins absorbed into your lungs and body. And then seven, the more frequently you use cannabis, the more likely you are to develop these adverse health outcomes, especially if you're using cannabis on a daily or near daily basis. So you should try to limit your cannabis use as much as possible to once a month or once a week. Number eight, cannabis impairs your ability to drive and operate other machinery or participate in other activities, so you should not engage in these types of activities while under the influence. Number nine, some people are more likely to develop problems related to cannabis use. So in order to lower your risk, people with a personal or family history of psychosis or substance use problems, as well as women who are pregnant or breastfeeding, should not use cannabis at all. And then lastly, the 10th one is you should avoid combining any of these listed above together to really limit your risk factors. So these are the types of recommendations that have been put forth evidence-based in order to really limit the negative effects associated with cannabis use. So now for the last little bit of the presentation, I'm going to switch gears into sex and gender and the influence that they have on cannabis use patterns as well as the effects of cannabis. So sex and gender not only matter in cannabis use, but in health in numerous ways. So sex matters when we're ingesting substances into our bodies, and this is because our bodies will respond differently if we're male or female. And because of these differences in our biology and other things like physiology, our chromosomes, our genetics, different hormones, our metabolism, certain anatomical features, so our body will respond differently based on these things, based on our sex. And then we're also differently impacted by our genders. So our genders are culturally and socially defined and include aspects like gender identity, gender norms, roles, relations, and these all depend and all differ depending on if we're girls, boys, men, women, or gender diverse individuals. And this can really have a large impact as well on how we respond to various health issues, including cannabis use. And so historically, women have been more excluded from research in general, including cannabis research. So the evidence that we do have in this area is limited, but it's definitely starting to shift and changes are being made in order to include the study of females in both animal and human research, as well as gender diverse individuals over the past decade. But this is kind of a new area, so the evidence that we do have is limited. So sex and gender are separate, although in some cases they can be intertwined. And a lot of the research that I'll be discussing today didn't properly define if they were looking at sex or gender or both. So that's also something that needs to continue to change to look at them separately and properly define for researchers to properly define what they're looking at. So I wanted to first just give a brief overview of sex, gender, and cannabis use. So, epidemiological studies have demonstrated that men are more likely to use cannabis than women, and the prevalence rate is nearly double for men compared to women. And although men have historically shown higher rates of cannabis use, recent evidence has demonstrated that the gender gap is narrowing in the prevalence of use. And similarly, men are also more likely to meet criteria and be diagnosed with cannabis use disorder. And then additionally, among medical cannabis users, men and women report using cannabis for different reasons. So, for example, women are more likely to use cannabis to treat symptoms such as anxiety, nausea, anorexia, and headaches and irritable bowel syndrome compared to men. And then there's also differences among non-medical users in their motivations for use. And then significant differences also exist in the methods of consumption. So men tend to prefer smoking methods of consumption and using higher potency concentrates, where women tend to prefer using edible preparations, but this is kind of mixed in findings. And then lastly, there's also biological differences reported among men and women and how their bodies and brain respond differently to cannabis. So, in terms of cannabis use, some sex and gender factors. So, sex related factors would be things like how our bodies respond to cannabis, how cannabis affects your brain, the development of tolerance and dependence to cannabis, and also the influence that a female's menstrual cycle might have on the effects of cannabis. And then gender related factors would include things like risks of cannabis use, access to care for cannabis use disorder, as well as societal's responses and the stigma for different genders surrounding cannabis use. And then lastly, exposure to marketing. So I'll go into each of these separately now. So, in terms of sex related factors, there's been a lot of research over the past decade looking at both sex differences in animals as well as humans. There's much more clear evidence in animals than humans. So, animal research has shown clear sex differences in the biological and behavioral effects of THC. So some studies have shown that female rats, so rats are what's most commonly studied in animal research. So female rats will break down THC into a more psychoactive compound. And when THC enters our system, it starts to be broken down, and female rats will actually preferentially metabolize THC into a more psychoactive compound. Male rats will do this as well, but to a lesser extent. And then female rats are also more sensitive to a range of THC effects, and female rats appear to develop tolerance at a faster rate than male rats. And then in terms of human research, there is some evidence of sex differences in the biological and subjective effects of THC, but the evidence is much more mixed and limited in humans. So some studies have found that when men and women consume the same amount of cannabis, women will actually produce higher levels of THC in their blood compared to males. And then some studies also show that women have an increased sensitivity to the subjective effects of cannabis. So when they smoke the same amount, females feel more high or might feel more of the anxiety related effects. And then lastly, women also demonstrate the same levels of impairment after consuming less cannabis. So this could be cognitive impairment as well as subjective high. And this is something we've found in our lab, as well as while under the influence of alcohol. So we had a study looking at the combined effects of alcohol and cannabis. And we found that this finding in women was further exacerbated while they were co-consuming alcohol and cannabis, which is really important because co-consumption of those two substances is really on the rise, particularly in young people. And then it's also important to point out that some studies have found no sex differences in the effects of cannabis. So there's definitely more research needed in this area. And then on the other hand, gender differences have also been studied, and findings from multiple studies suggest that gender differences do exist, and these would be in gender roles, norms, relations, and they all have a clear impact on patterns of cannabis use in numerous ways. So, like I mentioned, cannabis use is higher in men, and similarly, men and boys are more likely to experiment with various methods of consumption. And they're also reporting higher levels of smoking and vaping compared to women. And men are also more likely to consume cannabis in combination with other substances, particularly alcohol and tobacco. And then cannabis use and driving is more frequent among men, and similarly, men are more likely to ride in a car with as a passenger with someone who's under the influence of cannabis. And then some themes from qualitative research have emerged demonstrating that cannabis use is associated with adherence to traditional masculine norms, and that buying and maintaining cannabis supply is a male activity, and that men also use cannabis in order to facilitate male friendships with other men. And then one of the more consistent findings has revealed that the stigma remains higher for women cannabis users compared to men, and particularly a high stigma for women who are pregnant or mothers. And then one study found that in lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals, cannabis use rates were highest among transgender men. And this study also found that gender minority stress is associated with cannabis use. And then lastly, some studies have compared cannabis use rates among transgender and cisgender populations, with some estimates indicating that the lifetime prevalence of cannabis use is nearly 2 times as high among transgender compared to cisgender individuals. However, there really is a lack of research in non-heterosexual and gender diverse individuals, even though cannabis use rates are reportedly quite high among these populations. So we need more research in this area. And then lastly, I just wanted to tie this back to cannabis use disorder because I spent some time talking about that. So we also see sex and gender differences in cannabis use disorder. So like I said, men are more likely to meet criteria and be diagnosed with cannabis use disorder. However, women tend to demonstrate a faster escalation to problematic use. So this is something we call the telescoping effect, and this is cannabis use when you initially start using it to when it becomes problematic use is a much faster period in women compared to men. And then women also tend to seek treatment after fewer years of regular cannabis use, and women tend to report more frequent and severe cannabis withdrawal symptoms. And finally, women also display a stronger association between cannabis use, psychological distress, mood and anxiety symptoms, and overall poor mental health associated with use. So it's really important to understand these sex and gender differences in order to kind of create better individualized treatment options. And then lastly, I'll just finish off by talking about some future directions as well as a cannabis study you can get involved in and then some resources. So, although there really has been a significant increase in the inclusion of women in research, the study of sex and gender differences in cannabis research over the past decade is still limited. So, much more research is really needed to better understand the benefits and risks of cannabis use for all genders, and particularly, like I said, especially in non-heterosexual and gender diverse populations. So once we have a better understanding of these differences or potential similarities, this research should be used to inform specific policy and practice. And it should also be used in prevention, public awareness, education, psychoeducation and treatment populations, and not only education in the general public, but also for policymakers, healthcare providers, and doctors. And then lastly, this research should be used to help shape gender-informed care to reduce gendered barriers to care. And gendered informed care is related to gender, but it's also related to other social determinants of health. And I didn't get the chance to talk about this today, but this term of intersectionality is very important. And it acknowledges that numerous other identities, such as race, socioeconomic status, can all be intersected together to create a social identity. So we can't really speak to a gender identity without acknowledging how it may be interacting with other identities. And then this research should also be used to inform and provide specialized and inclusive supports and programs. So now I just very briefly wanted to discuss a study that I'm working on that if you're interested in this type of research, you could get involved in. So, due to the complex and evolving nature of gender and its different contexts, qualitative research is really imperative to better understand gender differences in cannabis use. So, this is a qualitative research study and it's examining the relationship between gender, cannabis use, and the trajectory to seeking treatment for cannabis related problems. And the aim of this project is to broadly examine participants' perceptions of how their gender has shaped their cannabis use and related problems, and to also examine perceptions of cannabis related gender norms. So it really just involves a single open-ended interview session. It typically lasts around 45 minutes, and it can be done virtually or in person, whatever the participants prefer. And the eligibility criteria is quite open. So there's only two inclusion criteria that participants have to be 19 years or older, and that they are either currently or have ever received in the past any sort of treatment for cannabis related problems. And there's no exclusion criteria. So participants can also be receiving treatment for other comorbidities, including other substance use disorders. And it's definitely inclusive to all genders, and we're hoping to capture a population of gender diverse individuals to learn more. And then it is compensated, so with a $25 e-gift card or cash. So if you're interested in participating or know someone who may be eligible, they can contact myself or Dr. Justin Matheson, who designed this study. And I'll put my contact information up at the end again. And then lastly, I just wanted to leave you with some resources. So these are resources that dive a lot deeper into a lot of the topics that I only briefly touched on today. So things like cannabis use during pregnancy or the risk of developing psychosis or sex and gender. So all of these resources have some really great information as well as some courses on kind of up-to-date information on all of these topics. So I think these resources will be sent out at the end with my slides as well, so you can get them then. And that is everything. So thank you so much for listening today. I'm sorry, I think I went a bit long with questions, but if you don't get the chance to ask a question today with time, you are also feel free to email me at any time. So thank you.